The global chessboard just shifted beneath our feet, and Washington didn't see it coming. While the Trump administration threatens tariffs and military intervention in Latin America, Russia has quietly positioned itself as Mexico's economic guarantor, offering to purchase Mexican oil if the United States follows through on its trade war threats. This isn't just diplomatic posturing. This is Moscow drawing a red line in America's backyard, fundamentally challenging 7 decades of Washington's presumed dominance over the Western Hemisphere. The implications are staggering. Mexico, America's largest trading partner, now has an economic escape hatch that bypasses U.S. pressure entirely. Russia gains strategic leverage in a region Washington has considered its exclusive sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine. And Trump? He's cornered. Escalate the tariffs and drive Mexico deeper into Russia's orbit, or back down and reveal the limits of American economic coercion. This is what multipolarity looks like in practice. Not abstract theory, but concrete alternatives to U.S. hegemony emerging in real time. The unipolar moment is collapsing, and the consequences are landing right on our southern border. Let's break down exactly what happened here, because the mainstream media is either ignoring this story entirely or framing it as some kind of Russian interference rather than what it actually is, which is a rational response by Moscow to Washington's increasingly erratic and aggressive posture toward its neighbors. The Trump administration has been escalating rhetoric against Mexico for weeks now, threatening everything from tariffs to border closures to what some officials have hinted could be military operations against cartel infrastructure on Mexican soil. Now put yourself in Mexico City's position for a moment. You're a sovereign nation being threatened economically and potentially militarily by your largest trading partner, a country that happens to be the global hegemon with a documented history of regime change operations throughout Latin America. What do? You look for alternatives. You diversify your partnerships. You seek security guarantees from other major powers. This is exactly what any rational government would do when facing this level of pressure and uncertainty. Russia's offer isn't charity, and it isn't some sinister plot. It's strategic opportunism combined with legitimate economic interest. Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers, but it's been looking to expand its markets, especially as Western sanctions have attempted to isolate Russian energy from European markets. Mexico produces significant quantities of oil, around 1.7 million barrels per day, and if the United States slaps tariffs on Mexican imports or otherwise disrupts the economic relationship, Mexico will need buyers. Russia steps in and says, "We'll buy your oil." Simple as that. But the geopolitical implications are anything but simple, because what Russia is really saying is that Washington no longer has the ability to economically strangle countries in its own hemisphere without those countries having viable alternatives. That's a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. Think about how different this is from even 15 years ago. In the early 2000s, if the United States threatened a Latin American country with economic isolation, that country had very limited options. Maybe they could turn to Europe, but Europe was, and largely still is, subordinate to Washington's foreign policy agenda, especially on matters in the Western Hemisphere. China was still emerging as an economic power and wasn't yet confident enough to directly challenge U.S. influence in Latin America. Russia was dealing with its own economic chaos and wasn't in a position to project power globally. So countries in Latin America basically had to accept whatever terms Washington dictated or face genuine isolation and economic collapse. We saw this play out in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua. These countries faced brutal sanctions and had very few ways to circumvent them, but the world has changed dramatically. China is now the largest trading partner for most of South America. Russia has rebuilt its economic strength and is willing to challenge U.S. hegemony directly. Alternative financial systems are emerging that allow countries to trade without using the dollar. The BRICS bloc is expanding and creating new institutions that provide alternatives to the IMF and World Bank. This is the context in which Russia's offer to Mexico must be understood. Now let's talk about Trump's predicament, because this really does back him into a corner, and I think his administration understands that even if they're not admitting it publicly. Trump ran on a platform of economic nationalism and getting tough on trade deals that he claimed hurt American workers. Mexico has been a constant target of his rhetoric going back to his first campaign in 2016. He's threatened tariffs repeatedly. He's talked about building the wall. He's renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA. His base expects him to be tough on Mexico. But here's the problem. If Trump actually follows through with major tariffs or economic sanctions against Mexico, he risks pushing Mexico into a closer relationship with Russia and potentially China. Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner. Over $700 billion in trade flows between these two countries annually. The supply chains are deeply integrated, especially in manufacturing and automotive industries. Millions of American jobs depend on this trade relationship. If Trump disrupts it and Mexico turns to Russia and China to fill the gap, American companies lose access to a crucial market and manufacturing base, American consumers face higher prices, and the U.S. loses strategic influence over a country that shares a 2,000-mile border. That's not winning. That's a strategic catastrophe. But if Trump backs down, if he decides not to impose the tariffs, or if he scales back his threats, then he looks weak to his base. He looks like he's all talk and no action. He's spent years building an image as the tough negotiator who doesn't back down, and suddenly he's in a situation where the rational strategic choice is to de-escalate. This is what I mean when I say Russia has cornered Trump. Moscow has created a situation where Trump's two options are both bad for him. Either he escalates and causes long-term strategic damage to U.S. interests in Latin America, or he backs down and damages his political brand. It's a masterful piece of geopolitical maneuvering when you really look at it. And let's be clear about something else. This isn't just about Mexico, and it isn't just about oil. This is Russia sending a message to every country in Latin America that there are now alternatives to U.S. dominance. If Washington threatens you, Moscow is willing to step in. If the U.S. imposes sanctions, Russia will offer trade deals. If American companies pull out, Russian companies will fill the void. This is exactly what China has been doing economically for the past 2 decades throughout the global south, and now Russia is following that playbook with a more explicitly geopolitical edge. We're watching the construction of an alternative pole of power in real time, and Latin America, which has been under U.S. hegemony longer than almost any other region, is increasingly looking toward these alternatives. The timing of this is also significant. Trump just took office. His administration is still finding its footing. There are competing factions within his team about how aggressive to be on foreign policy. Some want a more isolationist approach. Some want to escalate confrontation with China. Some are focused on the Middle East. And in the middle of all this internal chaos, Russia makes this move with Mexico. It forces the Trump administration to respond quickly to a situation they probably weren't prepared for. It exposes the contradictions in Trump's foreign policy, which wants to be simultaneously nationalist and isolationist, but also wants to maintain U.S. global dominance. You can't have both. You can't withdraw from multilateral institutions, antagonize your allies, threaten your neighbors, and also expect to maintain hegemonic control over entire regions. The world doesn't work that way, and Russia is demonstrating that very clearly. What's fascinating is how little coverage this is getting in mainstream American media. When you do see coverage, it's typically framed as Russian meddling or interference, as if Mexico is some passive victim being manipulated by Moscow, rather than a sovereign nation making strategic decisions in its own interest. This framing reveals so much about the imperial mindset that still dominates U.S. foreign policy thinking. The assumption is that Latin American countries don't have agency, that they're not capable of making their own decisions, that anytime they do something Washington doesn't like, it must be because some outside power is pulling the strings. It's patronizing and it's detached from reality. Mexico is making a rational calculation. If the U.S. is going to threaten us economically, we need alternatives. Russia is offering an alternative. Why wouldn't Mexico at least explore that option? The fact that Washington sees this as some kind of betrayal or interference just shows how entitled the U.S. foreign policy establishment has become. There's also a broader economic dimension here that's worth examining. The global oil market is increasingly fragmented. For decades, oil trading was denominated almost exclusively in US dollars. This gave Washington enormous leverage because any country that wanted to buy or sell oil had to use dollars, which meant they needed access to the dollar-based financial system, which meant they had to play by Washington's rules. But that system is breaking down. Russia and China have been trading oil in their own currencies for years now. India has been buying Russian oil and paying in rupees and rubles. Saudi Arabia, longtime U.S. ally and linchpin of the petrodollar system, has been making noises about accepting yuan for oil sales. If Mexico starts selling oil to Russia in rubles, or if they work out some kind of barter arrangement or use alternative payment systems, that's another crack in the foundation of dollar hegemony. And dollar hegemony is one of the key pillars of American global power. It's what allows the U.S. to run massive trade deficits, finance enormous military budgets, and impose sanctions that actually bite. If that system continues to erode, American power erodes with it. We also need to consider the military dimension, even though this deal is ostensibly about economics. Russia offering to buy Mexican oil creates a relationship that could evolve in multiple directions. Economic ties often lead to diplomatic coordination, security cooperation, intelligence sharing. Now, I'm not suggesting Russian military bases are going to pop up in Mexico next year. That's not realistic given the power dynamics and geographic realities. But even a modest increase in Russia-Mexico cooperation represents a significant challenge to U.S. security assumptions. The United States has gotten used to treating Latin America as a region where it faces no peer competitor challenges. The Monroe Doctrine, even if not explicitly invoked anymore, still shapes American thinking. The idea that a major power like Russia or China would have significant influence in the Western Hemisphere is treated as almost unthinkable in Washington. But it's happening. It's not hypothetical. It's concrete reality unfolding right now. This also intersects with the broader crisis of U.S.-Mexico relations around immigration, border security, and the fentanyl crisis. Trump has been threatening Mexico over these issues, demanding that Mexico do more to stop migration and drug trafficking or face economic consequences. But here's the contradiction. You can't simultaneously threaten a country and expect that country to cooperate with you on complex security challenges. Cooperation requires trust, coordination, and mutual benefit. If Mexico feels threatened by the United States, if Mexican leaders believe that Washington sees them as adversaries rather than partners, why would they go out of their way to help the U.S. with its domestic political problems around immigration and drugs? And if Russia is offering Mexico an economic partnership with no strings attached, no demands about changing domestic policies or cracking down on cartels or stopping migration, that's an attractive alternative. Russia doesn't care about Mexican immigration policy. Russia doesn't care about fentanyl flowing into the United States. Russia cares about geopolitical positioning and challenging U.S. hegemony. From Moscow's perspective, anything that weakens Washington's grip on Latin America is a win. The Venezuelan dimension is also worth mentioning here because Russia's support for Venezuela has been a point of contention for years. Russia has provided economic assistance, military equipment, and diplomatic backing to the Maduro government despite U.S. sanctions and regime change efforts. That support has been crucial in allowing Venezuela to survive what has been an extraordinarily aggressive U.S.-led campaign to overthrow the government. If Russia is now expanding its presence in Mexico, that creates a kind of strategic continuity in the region. It's not just Venezuela anymore as an isolated case. It's a broader pattern of Russia establishing economic and diplomatic relationships throughout Latin America that serve as a counterweight to U.S. influence. And these relationships reinforce each other. Russian support for Venezuela makes sense as part of a larger strategy of building influence across the region. Russian engagement with Mexico, even if it's primarily economic at this stage, fits into that same strategic framework. Now, the question becomes what happens next? Does Mexico actually follow through on exploring this Russian offer, or is this just leverage in negotiations with Washington? My sense is that it's both. Mexico is absolutely serious about diversifying its economic partnerships because the Trump administration has made it clear that the US-Mexico relationship cannot be taken for granted. But Mexico is also using this Russian interest as leverage in whatever negotiations or discussions are happening behind the scenes with the Trump administration. It's a way of saying, look, if you push us too hard, we have options. That's smart diplomacy. But the fact that this option exists at all, the fact that Russia can credibly make this offer and Mexico can credibly consider it, that's what represents the fundamental shift. 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible. The United States would have had the power to shut it down through pressure on both Russia and Mexico. Today, Washington doesn't have that power. The hegemon can threaten, but it can no longer dictate terms the way it once could. This is the reality of multipolar world order emerging before our eyes. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it's deeply unsettling for a U.S. foreign policy establishment that has grown comfortable with uncontested dominance. But for much of the world, particularly in the global south, this represents an opportunity to play major powers off against each other, to negotiate better terms, to pursue independent foreign policies without facing immediate punishment. Mexico is testing the limits of this new reality, and Washington's response will tell us a lot about how much power the United States actually retains versus how much power it merely claims to have. The gap between those two things is growing, and stories like this one reveal just how wide that gap has become.